If you have said to yourself, I should write that, or if someone has said to you, you should write that, then I'm talking to you because you need to write. And that's why you're tuned in to yWrite. Hi, welcome to yWrite. I'm your host, Angela Grout, and it's great that you've tuned in again today for another exciting episode. I have a wonderful guest here with me today who's going to share with us some ways to capture our stories. You know, when I first started writing, I was writing alone in my house, alone in my office, wherever I was sitting down. And, you know, reading back and editing my pieces to myself definitely was helpful. But when I joined a writing group, I found that the input from others can really help to catapult your story along. So I joined the Springfield Museum Creative Writers Group right here in Springfield, Massachusetts. And the instructor of the course happened to be Theresa Chamberland. So at that first class, I sat down not knowing what to expect, but I did get a really wonderful instructor who has not only become my mentor and my writing coach, but she's also become a dear friend of mine. So today I have Theresa Chamberland on the show, and Theresa helps people to capture their stories not only in writing, but also in film. She teaches the creative writing the creative writers group and the memoir group at the Springfield Museum. She's also actively writing her own memoirs. And she is an active member in the International Women's Writers Guild and the National Association of Memoir Writers. She is the founder of StoryCatcher Studios in South Hadley, and we're going to talk more about not only that, but about how she got to the Springfield Museum and exactly what she has helped me to do on my journey as a writer. So I want to welcome today my friend and superior coach here, Theresa Chamberland. Hi, Theresa.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
I've been looking forward to this show, as you know. We've been chatting all along. We've known each other for about 5 years now.
7.
7 years now. Good thing this is why she can edit some of my pieces. Edit while I talk. That's perfect. Yeah, so 7 years ago, that's when the museum, I think with COVID, the 2 years of COVID, I've kind of blocked them out, so it feels like 5, but yeah, 7 years ago. And you had just started teaching there about a year prior, correct?
Yeah, I started in 2016, the summer of 2016.
And how did you get involved in doing memoir writing and to teach it?
Well, I started taking classes with Jan Sadler. She's the one who started the creative writing and memoir writing classes at at Springfield Museums. And she did it for almost 25 years, and we became good friends. I hosted some of her workshops at my house when I lived in Holyoke and then in South Hadley. And so I've been writing since I started working with her. We worked together, and I used to teach her web development, and she said to me, I'm really not this stupid. You have to come to my classes. and so the rest is history. I stayed with her for a long time. So since about 2001 or 2, I've been writing my memoirs.
And you're writing them along with the class in the writing group that you have.
Yes.
And I actually had, in the past episode, I had the Springfield Write-Up, a writing group, come on and discuss about free writes and getting together. But the class at the museum is different. And I want to share with the audience a little bit about what's different from that, because it's you know, structured, and I love the fact that there are so many professional writers in the group that are all working on different things. So do you want to talk about a little bit about how that class works?
Sure. So we meet in the fall, the winter, the spring for 10-week sessions, and then in the summer for usually about 6 weeks. And it's a 3-hour class, 10 to 1, and we come together, and if you didn't read last week, then we start with having about 3 different people read their stories and give feedback. We take a break, and then we write for an hour. We write together for an hour. And then we come back again, and we read our stories, and we get feedback. And we tend to give positive feedback. We want to be encouraging to people. But a lot of the writers in my Wednesday group in particular have been with me and with Jan before me for all of these years, and so they want more critical feedback. So you can say, I'm looking for this type of feedback, or just whatever you want to give me, I'm open to hearing.
Yeah, and not only, I want to mention to the audience that not only are they in person at the museum, but they're also offered on Zoom.
Yes, when I said to my class one day, if we have to go to Zoom, no, we want to stay in person. I said, okay, if the museum closes and we have to go in Zoom, do you want to do that? And they said, only if we have to. And so it was a very smooth transition into Zoom. Mm-hmm. Two of my classes, we were meeting Wednesday, Thursday, and we just didn't miss us, didn't skip a heartbeat. No, we even had some live recordings through the Springfield Museums and also Storrs Library. They recorded us live.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was a lifesaver for me during COVID, because, you did want to get together with your group of writers, especially when, for me, I'm working on a novel. Some of them are working on their memoirs. Some of them are working on, whether it was a newsletter for the organization that they're with, or their own, fictional stories. But, doing the Zooms, and, I wanted to skip back. I know there was something you said. We did the readings at the library. Like Storrs Library in Longmeadow opened up to allow members of your class to come in and share pieces that they wrote.
Right, and that's been going on since when Jan was there. That's something she did all the time. And now that we're back into walking about the world most of the time, most of us without mask, we had another event just last week, and it was exciting for my readers to have 40 people in the audience, because in the past it's been like 15 or 18
Yeah,
tops.
well, the crowds dwindled after COVID. People were afraid to come out, but when we were on Zoom, we did have a pretty large audience.
We certainly did international.
Watching, and it was really nice to be able to, we read raw material in the class, a lot of times. Sometimes we don't come in with the edited piece. We're writing and sharing raw. But then doing it at the library or doing on these Zooms, we're kind of having that piece edited, and it's a little bit more of a final polished draft, and now you're sharing it more publicly, because of course everything that happens in the classroom stays in the classroom.
Yes.
So that was a really nice experience, and I definitely liked doing that, and I know the other members of the class also did. So kudos to you, and if someone's looking for a class, I highly suggest calling the museum. But I know there's other ones out there.
What was interesting was that during Zoom, we had people from across the country. We had somebody in Florida. We had somebody in the Harvard area. We had somebody from Pennsylvania. And so when we came back to in person in the classroom, my Zoom class wanted to stay in Zoom.
Yeah.
And I mean, we would lose a few people that you get to really be friends with people when they tell stories that you don't normally tell strangers.
Yeah, well, especially when they're working on a piece, and we want to know exactly what they're working on so that we can find out what's happening next.
Right. And you mentioned COVID. So one of the things that happened during COVID is there were a lot of people writing about COVID stories and what was going on. And my thing has always been, if you're stuck on what to write the story that calls out loudest to you. And COVID was shouting at everybody. And so there were some funny things about, I wonder what it'll be like to not color my hair now that I'm gray and I'm not going to the hairdresser because she's not open. And there were funny stories, and difficult ones also.
Yeah, no, it's a really great opportunity to explore something that's going to surprise you. Like if you're providing a prompt, and I go into class and I say, okay, today I'm working on, chapter 14 of this story that I'm on. Even that prompt can help me to tie in my story so it can reopen a door that I didn't see coming, which is really nice. But like you said, sometimes, especially with our warm-up exercises, sometimes I'm like, all right, I have to just do what's coming naturally, and it's like, oh yeah, COVID today just seems like, if it was today I might talk about the heat or something, how hot it is. But it's great because being in this writers group, you provide a very safe space for everyone.
Thank you.
It's a very safe, confidential space that, we know we can share our stories, because especially when you're going to go public with the story later, and even if it's a private story, you want to know that it's held in confidence right now because it's a work in progress.
Right, because you want to write like no one else is going to read it. So you want to write the things, again, that you might not tell your mother or your child or your friend, that you want to write those things. Those are part of your life. That's your memoir stories, your secrets. And you can choose, if you decide to either share these stories with your family or to publish them, you can edit them out, but don't edit them out until you've written the whole story, and then decide if you want to share them. So in the classroom, people will read very confidential stories. And I get that again and again, that it feels safe in there. And I follow what I was taught from Jan, which is that you lead by example. So I read vulnerable stories. I wrote stories about a relationship gone bad, and then suddenly people were writing about bad relationships. So because they felt safe and they hadn't written like that before. And we inspire one another. Somebody writes about, oh, when I was at Girl Scout camp, and then it's suddenly, oh, I was at Boy Scout camp. I had 4-H. And then you start getting ideas from other people's stories about what you can write yourself.
Yeah, and I approached the class when I was working on April Rain. Quietly went in and didn't tell anyone I'd already published 2 books, because it was one of those things that I didn't want any expectations to be made of me. Actually, it's similar to when I was working at the flower shop. I don't know if I shared this story with you, but I took a flower shop class at Bay Path University, and I'd already been working at the shop for 5-6 years, so I didn't go in saying I had a job at the flower shop. But of course they started teaching, and I was like, oh boy, this is this is a knife, this is leather leaf, this is a vase, you fill it with water. And I'm like, whew. And I made my arrangement, and of course I did it a little bit quicker than everybody else, and it looked more professional, because I was making 15, 20 a day. And of course they're like, oh, you should get a job at a flower shop. And I'm like, well, here you have one. But when I went into the writers group, like because I was working on such a very sensitive murder mystery, it was like I didn't want to share in class what I was working on, but I would take your prompts and be able to write sort of a memoir piece, but then be able to transform them into like a fictional piece, which was very helpful. And I think, and I know that a lot of the guidance, came from you. So, I know that you always will share with us not only, your own wisdom, but you'll share like books that are available for us to read, or websites to go to, or sometimes even contests to enter and things like that. And I know that there's several books that you've recommended to me. Some I bought, some I borrowed, some I went to the library and looked up, because they really are helpful. And I'm wondering if you had to pick 2 or 3 books that you would say to someone who's looking to start writing their story, what would you recommend?
Well, I brought a little list with me.
Good.
And I just started listening to, I kept hearing someone talk about this book called Poet Warrior, a memoir, and that's by, and it's read, I'm listening to it, it's read by the author, which is a fabulous voice she's got. She's the first Joy Harjo. Is that right? Harjo, sorry. Harjo. And she's the first Native American to serve as a U.S. Poet Laureate, and it's a fabulous. So Poet Warrior is a memoir I recommend. And then Dani Shapiro, she has the book Inheritance, a memoir of genealogy, paternity, and love. So we want to be reading memoir if we're going to be writing memoir. And a lot of people, I remember when I was in college and my English professor was saying, you have to read. And I'm like, I'm reading too much already. You need to read. But Dani Shapiro's book, any of her books, you dive into it and you're done in a weekend, because it's engaging. That's how you want to write. You want to so you want to read stories that are like how you want to write. And the last one is Stephen King. My students are always raving. I've recommended On Writing, a memoir of the craft, and the students are always recommending that to other students. I recommend that.
I think I've shared that story with you where, I was sitting writing April Rain going, why am I writing this? Like, this doesn't seem like, it's not my comfortable genre, I don't think. And, and then I thought, well, how does Stephen King write these, like, I'm going to call them horrific novels. I haven't read them. So I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to have to go get one of his books and read it, because I'm judging it just from what I heard. And, I decided I don't want to read that, because, if I put in whatever you put into your body, becomes kind of part of you. And I'm like, oh, if it's really horrific, I don't want to read that. So I wrote him and asked him a question and said, why do you write what you write? Like, what makes you called to write this, I'm assuming gore and horror and things like that. And a couple days later, I went to the library and and I looked on the bookshelf and I'm like, all right, Angela, just take a book and open it and, put on your big girl panties here. Let's just check it out. And I happened to see the book on writing and I was like, oh, I'll read that. So I took it and literally sat in the library, read it cover to cover, and it explained everything to me of why he does what he does. And a week later, I get an email back, probably from his people, but maybe from him, saying, I wrote a book called On Writing that explains it all. And I said to myself, yes, I know. The universe opened up and shared that. And, even he says, when the universe tells you to write something, it will knock, 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 knock until you answer that door. It doesn't always just go away. So, for me, writing the novel April Rain, writing memoirs really did help. And the books that you mentioned, for people looking to share their own stories, like whether they want to pass them down through the generations or, want to publish that recipe in a book for the public to have or something, writing memoir is always, powerful. And reading memoir is really, kind of always can grab your attention because it's that first person point of view, and putting a first person point of view into a fictional story is very similar to memoir writing. So I think that there's a definite huge connection there. You're writing your actual memoirs, and I've been able to witness this for the last 7 years, so I know a lot of it and I know a lot of it stays in the room. But do you want to talk a little bit about what's prompted you to write your memoirs? Obviously the fact to share with your students so that we can see, valuable piece of writing, but also, what's in it for you?
Well, I was writing stories, whatever story came out loudest. Jan used to have a prompt where we didn't have a classroom in the beginning. We were in like an art gallery back in the early 2000s. And she would say, go use the artwork as your muse. Go to the artwork. And I was like, this isn't working for me. And a few years ago, I found a piece that I wrote about my dad, and it was inspired by my dad, who had passed a couple of years earlier. It was inspired by the art, because I wrote down the name of the piece and who it was by and all the details. And so that does work, that going to an art gallery, going outside and looking and watching and observing and writing something that comes to mind. There's a little kid, and when you were a little kid kind of connection there.
Yeah.
So at some point, I'm going to say about 5 years ago, I suddenly had the idea of, people always ask me, how did you end up in Hawaii? Why did you leave Rhode Island? Why did you leave Hawaii? How did you end up in Western Mass? And California in between there. And I realized that my family and a lot of my friends don't know who I was as a young 20-year-old on a one-way ticket to Oahu, and my life that followed there. They don't know about the, New Age workshops that I went to, and they all know about the romance that went bad. But anyways, and so I realized that I wanted to answer that question specifically for my nieces and nephews. Answer the questions of where, why I did that. And it gets a little complicated, about my life in Hawaii and answering those questions, because I don't know how much of that romance gone bad do I say.
Share.
And so I had a period where I wrote a lot about it, and then I was like, okay, I need to move this aside for now. And I decided that my publisher for my first memoir is going to say, I want you to write that romance as an entire book, and then I'll go there.
Yeah, no, it's so true, because as a mom, like, my kids don't know me as a dancer, and I was a dancer my whole life. I taught and choreographed dance for 12 or 15 years, but they know nothing about that life of mine. It's like completely out of their wheelhouse. So for me to write stories about that, it's brings me back to that moment, but it also shares a piece of me that was very important to my family. Owning a flower shop for over 3 decades, obviously my children witness that. My youngest right now is 14. Will their children ever know me as a florist? That's all I've been for 3 decades, really. So it's like, oh, wow, the memoirs of the florist, and now here life is, changing again. We're evolving, and, where we're on this roller coaster of life, I always say I'm white knuckling it and ready for the ride.
And at the same time, when we're writing our memoirs, it isn't just telling them the stories. We want to show them. We want them to feel what we're feeling. We want to write as if we have a camera in our hand and we're showing a movie of our life. That's how they can read it. And we want messages in there. What do we want them to take away? What did I learn? And that's one of the beauties of writing memoirs, that you learn what you didn't realize. You see things differently. And I was like trying to remember, like, how did I end up seeing this guy the way that I saw him? Why was that so difficult to leave? And I wrote, Dear 21-year-old Theresa, from an 85-year-old, that I'm not anywhere near that, myself as an 85-year-old, and I had a conversation, and I had some epiphanies in that writing. Now, from that, some of that writing is just to get it out and then to understand, but parts of that went into my story.
Yeah.
So everything doesn't necessarily, like when you do a prompt writing, you might start with a quote, and the quote may be there, but when you're done, it doesn't make sense. It just got you warmed up. But I have a student who used a quote with a lion or a tiger in it, and she used it as metaphor in 3 different ways in her story, and it was amazing. So the prompt gets you going.
Oh yeah, the prompts definitely can get you going.
And you don't need to do it if a prompt doesn't work for you, then you don't need to do it. If you know where you're going to write, just start writing.
So I'm going to segue here a little bit to, not only do you get people to put it on paper, but like you said, you want them to write their story on paper like someone's looking through a movie camera lens. Right. And you own StoryCatcher Studios. Can you tell us what StoryCatcher Studio is? I mean,
yeah. So I'm video recording people telling their stories, and so I'll come to your house. It might be one person, it might be a couple, and you may have a list of questions, stories that you want to answer, that you want to tell, or maybe your daughter or son or somebody has given you questions. If you don't, I always have questions. There's standard things we want to know about people's lives. Yeah. So I had one person who was 88, and it was going to be a 90-year-old birthday gift for her from her children, and she's like, here's what we're going to do. She took the director's role. So nice. I work with people in helping them tell their story. It might be a series of 3 or 4 15-minute stories or short stories. A lot of the grandchildren can't sit for an hour or 3 hours in some cases. They don't have the attention span, so sometimes we break it up into smaller pieces.
Yeah, they're like little segments like you might see on Dateline, but in a nice way.
And then I pre-interview them to sort of see what it is, what our objectives are, and talk about some of the stories they want to tell, and do you have photographs of any of this in your life, so that we can weave. And some people even have some video. One person had taught snow skiing, and somebody in the town had used him as a ski instructor coming down the mountain as a commercial, and so he had that. They gave us permission to put that in the video.
Oh, that's his very memoir.
Cool. So the old media can be modernized. You can have your photographs digitized, and the same with the videos that you've got.
And preserving someone's life story is just so sacred for families and even for that person. Yeah. Because we all want to know that our life was, had meaning, not just for us but for others also. So I think capturing memoirs on video is very powerful. Yeah. I know you've also done them for, some professional businesses in towns and things like that, preserving history. So, using video memoir to verbally tell a story is really powerful. So
the town of Wilmot, they did recordings from 2009 forward, and they had interviews with elders, and they wanted me to take these really long videos and edit them down to anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And I embed the music and embed the images that they send to me as well. The 88-year-old was my favorite person to work with. My second was a couple that I interviewed separately, and when it was all said and done, we sat down together and they watched the video of themselves, and they were sitting in a chair with both of their hands on the same armrest with their hands together, and she's got a towel wiping her eyes, and she's going, well, look at us, look at us, because she was on roller skates, photographs, Oh, it's just fabulous to see themselves, and the 88-year-old was saying, oh, I just love to watch myself,
Yeah. When my daughters were little, I would read them this book, and it was, the picture on the cover was a little old woman sitting in a wheelchair in a nursing home, and the cover was what do you see when you look at me? And this little girl would go into the nursing home, walk by this lady every day, and just kind of sometimes say hi and just walk away. And one day the little old lady said, what do you see when you look at me? And the little girl didn't really think of anything. And when she started telling her story to the little girl, like the little girl's imagination just changed everything. She was like, oh, I was a ballet dancer. And, you know, she's talking about how she, you know, danced, you know, on stage, and then how she had this whirlwind romance. And, you know, it's like, I love stories like that. And even from my kids being at a young age, sharing with them that, you know, people have so much within them. So, you know, you never want to judge, you know, the book by the cover, but even, you know, that age that you're seeing, because there's so much that made them get where they are.
Right.
So, and for me, you know, even writing my stories, you know, I always try to be very grateful and gracious in a way of the experiences I had, good, bad, or indifferent, because if I haven't had them, I wouldn't be where I am right now. Yeah. So in order to be grateful for where I am, I have to, you know, look back and sometimes, you know, write out the bad and the ugly, just to say, okay, you know, tear it up. But I have asked you this before, like, when do we start tearing up those rough drafts?
Oh, I don't have, I have filing cabinet, a whole drawer, really big drawer full of stories that I've handwritten over the years. I have journals back to when I was 15 years old.
Ditto.
And I have other things to deal with getting rid of in my life than dealing with that because I want to write, and if I'm in those filing cabinets, I just start the story from scratch. I don't go back in.
It is so true, because, you know, trying to get to the final piece, like, you can edit, you can, I mean, I hate to say that you can over edit, but there can be a time where you just have to say it's done. You know, like, this is good, let's let it go. From a florist standpoint, you know, I know, like, if I'm making a flower arrangement, I mean, I could keep adding and adding and adding and adding to it and make it look better and better, but I also realize there's a budget and a timeline and a deadline for it. And when, you know, you're working on a novel, if you have that, you know, budget and deadline, you're good. But if you're working on your memoir, you know, sometimes it can be different for people, because if they write one story and then they get some feedback from someone, they're re-editing it, and then they're presenting it again and getting more feedback, and then they're re-editing it. And, you know, and I know, you know, you've edited, you know, one chapter I think I've heard like 5 times, but I will say each time it got more details, that it was more interesting.
I merged three stories into one, and I go back and forth. I'm on an airplane and I'm remembering a story about my mom or a story about my brothers, and so I weave them together. That's what I'm doing, is I've put everything that I think belongs in my book in one manuscript, and then I am rearranging it as I go, oh yeah, that one on page 40 needs to come up here.
And the editing process is a whole different class.
It's a whole other conversation.
It's a whole other conversation. It's a whole other class. However, at this time, I'm going to talk about some classes, because in November, and Theresa's well aware of this because I've been talking, well, yWrite, we're going to have our very first in-person conference. The yWrite conference is going to be right here in Agawam, Massachusetts, on the first Saturday of November 2023, which is November 4th. May the force be with you. And we are going to have an in-person writing group where there will be breakout sessions to not only join a writer's group for the day or take one of maybe Theresa's writing classes, to find another class to help you with editing, or, you know, just to begin starting to write. So I want to just put that out there right now. There'll be more details to follow. Of course, you can learn more about that on my website at angelamgrout.com and on our YouTube channel, which is now streaming on all podcasting channels, and that is at youtube.com/yWrite, and that's the letter Y, small as in yWrite, because you're going to write. I also want to say that usually at the end of the show I provide a prompt, but today I have pre-asked Theresa to do it, because, you know, as my own writing instructor, she does provide prompts. So in a minute she's going to give you the prompt to start writing. So get your pen and paper out. First you're going to write down, you know, of course, the YouTube channel at yWrite, so you can subscribe and follow, and then the date, November 4th, so you can get ready for our yWrite First Conference here in Agawam, Massachusetts. Theresa, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
I know I'm going to have you back, because we have so much that we can share, not just to help them write, but, you know, just sharing our own stories of what we've gone through, because sometimes in the instruction that we give can help, but the examples you learn a little bit more from. Again, I want to thank Studio 954. I want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to yWrite, to give me the opportunity to host this show and to share with you a little bit of me and my passion for writing and my passion to connect with other writers too. So thank you very much. And if you're ready, set that timer for, give yourself maybe 10 minutes and start writing with the prompt that Miss Theresa Chamberlain is going to give us. So Theresa, do you want to give us that prompt?
Sure. So this is a different type than a quote that I often give or a big example. Let's say that you've just realized, for whatever reason, that you only have time to tell one story, to either record it or to use a pen to record it or the keyboard or a video camera. You only have time to write one story. And so what one story calls out to you loudest? If this was the only story that you could tell people, what would that story be? And just start writing. You could even make little side notes as you're writing of other details you want to add, but stay in a scene. Start in a scene anywhere in that story. Give us a scene of where you are, what time it is, who's there, what's happening, what's the aromas in the air, and just start with the scene somewhere in the middle of the story, and then keep going and see where it leads you.
Thank you. I'm thinking that prompt definitely is probably the prompt I used to write Dear Baby Get Out, because Dear Baby Get Out is the memoir of childbirth and the final days. So it's almost like, okay, I've got to pick one story. People say, oh, I'm going to tell the story of, my daughter's birth or something. I mean, this is like putting you in the scene of those final moments. So, I can understand, and I, totally get, and I hope the audience does too, that, you just write in the margins, like, if you don't remember the name of the hospital, like, you could write that down and do the research on that later. But, just to figure out what story is calling out to you and start writing. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in to yWrite, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.